The last student left at 3:30. Evelyn stood at the window and watched Clara Briggs skip down the path toward the main road, her red scarf flapping behind her, her little boots punching through the crust of yesterday's snow. Clara's mother was waiting at the gate. Evelyn could see her from here, the way she crouched down and caught Clara with both arms, the way they laughed at something only the two of them understood. Evelyn watched until they disappeared around the bend. Then she turned back to her classroom. The paper stars she'd spent 3 evenings cutting were still strung from the ceiling. The pine branches along the windowsill had dried out a little in the week since she'd put them up, and the needles were beginning to drop, leaving a thin green scatter across the floorboards. The nativity scene the older children had painted was propped on her desk. Mary a little lopsided, the donkey unrecognizable as a donkey, Joseph missing his left hand because Tommy Reeves had accidentally sat on the figure during the final painting session, and no one had had the heart to tell him. It looked exactly the way Christmas was supposed to look. She crossed to her desk and sat down in her chair. Her good chair, the one with the straight back that she kept meaning to replace because the left rear leg had developed a slight wobble, and sometimes it creaked when she shifted wrong. She hadn't replaced it. She kept meaning to. Outside, the snow was coming down again. Not hard, just a quiet, constant fall. The kind that looked soft and deliberate, each flake seeming to choose where it landed. By morning, the whole valley would be under another 2 inches at least. By morning, it would be Christmas. Evelyn opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out the tin that had lived there for the better part of 4 years. Inside, a letter from her sister in Ohio, dated the previous March. She'd read it so many times that the fold lines had worn soft, and the paper had taken on the particular fragile texture of something that had been handled more than it could bear. The letter said her sister hoped she was keeping well. The letter said they really should try to visit. The letter said they were all so busy. She put it back and closed the drawer. She was 31 years old. She had arrived in Harlan Creek 7 years ago with a teaching certificate, a trunk of books, and a quiet certainty that useful work was the same thing as a good life. She had spent those 7 years proving it to herself, mostly. She was good at her job, genuinely good, the kind of teacher children remembered, the kind who knew when to be hard and when to let something go, who could tell from the way a child held their pencil whether they were scared or just bored. The parents respected her. The school board renewed her contract every year without argument. She had given this town something real. She knew that. But the schoolroom doors closed at 3:30, and then the town went home, and she walked the quarter-mile to the boarding house where she rented a room from Mrs. Calloway, and she ate whatever Mrs. Calloway had left on the stove, and she read until the lamp oil got low, and she slept. 7 years of that. She was standing at the window again, She hadn't decided to move, she'd just ended up there, the way you do when your body knows the view better than your mind does. When she heard boots on the porch steps, she assumed it was someone's parent coming to retrieve a forgotten scarf or a lunch pail. She turned toward the door with her professional expression already assembled. The man who came in wasn't one of her students' fathers. Or rather, he was. He was Gideon Walker, whose son Thomas was in her third-year group. But he wasn't the kind of man you thought of as someone's father first. He was tall enough that he ducked slightly coming through the door frame, even though the frame was a standard height. And he was built the way men who worked land got built, wide through the shoulders, thick in the hands, the kind of solid that came from actual labor rather than any particular intention. His coat was dark wool, dusted with snow across the shoulders. He was holding his hat. "Mr. Walker," she said, "Thomas left his lunch pail on Thursday. I have it in the back if—" "That's not why I'm here," he said. He looked around the room in that slow, taking stock way that men from ranching families had. The way they looked at everything like they were assessing what work needed doing. His eyes moved over the paper stars, the pine branches, the lopsided nativity scene. He didn't say anything about any of it. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Thomas has been doing very well this—" "The kids are outside," he said. "All 5 of them. I left them by the fence." He turned the hat in his hands. "I need to ask you something, Miss Hart, and I want you to know I've thought about it. This isn't a thing I'm saying without having thought about it." She waited. "We don't have anyone for Christmas," he said. "This year Margaret's sister usually comes. She's been coming since Margaret passed, but her husband took sick and they can't travel. So it's just us. And I can cook well enough to keep everyone alive, but I can't—" He stopped, started again. The kids are going to wake up tomorrow morning, and I don't know how to give them Christmas. I don't know how to do it without her, and I've been standing in that kitchen for 2 days trying to work out how, and I can't." The hat turned in his hands, once, twice. "I know it's an unusual thing to ask," he said. "I know we don't know each other well. But Thomas talks about you a good deal, and the others know your name. Emily's been saying she wants to be a teacher because of you, which I'd appreciate you not telling her I told you. I thought if there was anyone who might say yes to a strange invitation on short notice, it might be a person who spent Christmas alone." Evelyn felt the words land somewhere she usually kept closed. "I apologize," he said quickly. "That was an unkind way to say it." "No," she said. "It was an honest way." He looked at her then, really looked, the way people didn't always bother to look at her, the way she was used to not being quite seen. He had dark eyes, darker than she'd noticed during the brief exchanges at school pickup. He looked tired in the bones, the way people got when they'd been carrying something heavy for a long time without setting it down. "The children," she said. "How old?" "Thomas is 8, you know that. Emily's 11. Then there's Danny, he just turned 6. The twins, Clara and James, they're 4. He paused. "They don't remember their mother much. The twins, they were barely 2 when she passed." Evelyn thought about Clara Briggs' mother at the gate, the way she'd caught her daughter with both arms. "What time tomorrow?" she said. Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, though he controlled it quickly. "I'd come collect you at 9 if that suits, or 8, whatever suits." 8, she said. "I'll bring what I can carry." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He was almost out the door when he stopped and turned back. "Miss Hart, it's not... I want to be clear. I'm not asking for... This is for the children. I'm not trying to suggest anything improper." She almost smiled. "Mr. Walker, I am a school teacher living alone in a boarding house on Christmas Eve. You've offered me a place to go and a family to cook for. I am not reading anything into it that isn't there." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right then," he said. "All right then," she agreed. After he left, she stood in the empty classroom for a long moment without moving. Then she turned to the tin on her desk, the one with her sister's letter in it, and she thought, "I'm going to stop reading that letter." She didn't throw it away, but she put it in the very back of the drawer and pushed something heavy in front of it. Then she started figuring out what she could carry 8 miles in a saddlebag. Gideon Walker had been telling himself for 3 years that things were getting better. He'd gotten fairly good at it. He could say it to his sister-in-law Ruth with a straight face. He could say it to his ranch hand Pete without Pete looking worried afterward. He could even say it to himself at 4 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, and the ranch was quiet and the dark felt like something pressing against the windows from outside. Things are getting better. The children are adjusting. We are all of us finding our way. He was not finding his way. He was surviving, which was different. He woke up, he worked, he fed his children, he put them to bed, and then he sat alone in the kitchen until he was tired enough to sleep without dreaming too much. That was not a man finding his way. That was a man going through motions and calling it living because the alternative was too bleak to look at directly. Margaret had been gone 3 years and 4 months. He knew the exact count because he couldn't seem to stop counting, even when he tried not to. 3 years, 4 months, 11 days by Christmas Eve. She died of a fever that had come on fast and gotten faster, the kind of sickness that was incomprehensible in its speed, the way she'd been laughing at the dinner table on a Tuesday and gone by the following Sunday. The doctor had called it a lung infection. Gideon had stood at her grave in March mud and not been able to call it anything. He'd been doing what needed doing ever since. The children were good kids. They were, genuinely. And he was grateful for that with a fierceness that sometimes caught him sideways. Emily had taken on too much, had gotten serious and efficient in a way that broke his heart a little when he saw it clearly, when he thought about what she should have been doing at 11 years old instead of checking on the twins every night before she went to sleep. Thomas was angry sometimes in a way he couldn't articulate, angry at nothing specific, at everything. Danny was quiet. The twins were too young to understand what they'd lost, and somehow that made it worse, seeing them run and laugh without knowing what was missing. He hadn't meant to walk to the schoolhouse. He'd been driving the wagon into town to pick up flour and a few things, and he told himself he was not going to do what he was thinking about doing and then he'd found himself stopping the wagon outside the schoolhouse anyway. He couldn't give his children Christmas. He tried to think through what that meant. He could hang a stocking. He could find something to put in it. He knew approximately how to do the mechanics of the thing. But Christmas in that house had been Margaret, start to finish. It had been her planning and her cooking and her particular way of making everything feel like an occasion, the way she'd wake the kids at dawn and act like each small discovery was the greatest surprise. He didn't know how to be that. He didn't know how to be her. He had 5 children who were going to wake up tomorrow morning and look at him, and he could not be enough. He didn't tell Miss Hart any of that. He said what he said, and it felt clumsy and badly worded, and he'd driven home half certain he'd made a fool of himself. But she'd said yes. He wasn't sure what to make of that. She showed up at 8 with a saddlebag over one shoulder and a basket over the other arm, and a look on her face that he'd come to recognize over the following weeks as her teaching face, the one she wore when she was walking into an uncertain situation and had decided in advance that she was going to handle it well. The basket had flour in it, and dried apples, and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that turned out to be a quantity of spice she'd apparently been saving for something. The saddlebag had books in it and a length of red ribbon and a small jar of hard candies. Emily met them at the door. He watched his daughter look at Miss Hart. Really look, the way Emily did when she was making up her mind about someone, with that precise and unforgiving assessment that she'd had since she was about 7, and that he sometimes worried would get her into trouble and other times thought might save her life. "You brought apples," Emily said. "I thought we might make a pie," Miss Hart said. "If you wanted to help." Emily looked at him briefly, a quick check, like she was asking permission for something she already wanted, and he nodded. "I've made pie before," Emily said. "I'm not very good at the crust." "Neither am I," Miss Hart said. "We'll see what we can manage." That was when Danny appeared at the top of the stairs, hair uncombed, still in his nightclothes, and stared down at the visitor with the solemn, unsettling focus that 6-year-olds sometimes had. "Are you the teacher?" he said. "I am," said Miss Hart. "Thomas says you're very strict," Danny said. "Thomas is mostly right," she said. Danny thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "Did you bring candy?" And Evelyn Hart opened her saddlebag and produced the small jar, and that was approximately how it began. The Walker Ranch house was the kind of place that had been loved hard and then left alone to miss it. Evelyn saw it within the first hour. The kitchen was functional and joyless, scrubbed clean, everything put away properly, nothing left out that didn't serve a purpose. Margaret Walker's presence was everywhere and nowhere. In the good china that had been moved to the very back of the cabinet behind the everyday plates, in the curtains that had been carefully hemmed and now hung slightly crooked because the curtain rod had slipped at some point and no one had gotten around to fixing it, in the small painted box on the mantelpiece that no one touched. The children orbited the house in their own patterns. Emily stayed close to the kitchen, watching what Evelyn was doing without quite admitting she was watching. Thomas disappeared outside to help his father with the morning chores and came back with cold ears and a guarded expression. Danny followed Evelyn from room to room at a distance of about 3 feet, not speaking but not leaving either, like a small cautious satellite. The twins, Clara and James, were loud and immediate and absolutely uninterested in social complexity. Within 40 minutes, they had adopted Evelyn completely and were competing for her lap. "James, get off," Clara said, pushing. "I was here first," James said. "You were not." "Was." "Children," Evelyn said, in a tone that made both of them pause. "There are 2 of you and 2 of my knees. Work it out." There was a brief negotiation. The problem was solved. Gideon, coming in from outside to wash his hands at the kitchen pump, watched this from the doorway for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Coffee?" he said. "Please," she said. The morning happened the way mornings sometimes do when you stop trying to manage them. In pieces, messily, better than expected, they made the pie. The crust was indeed not good. Emily's warning had been accurate, and there was a period of about 15 minutes where the dough would not cooperate, and Evelyn nearly gave up and suggested they try something else. And Emily said, "Don't give up, Miss Hart, that's what the dough wants," which was such an Emily thing to say that Evelyn laughed in spite of herself, a real laugh, the kind she didn't use that often. "What's funny?" Emily demanded. "Nothing. You're right. Roll harder." The pie went into the oven looking dubious. It came out looking genuinely credible. Thomas had come in by then, sitting at the far end of the kitchen table with his chin in his hand, watching without participating. He was a watchful kid. She'd noticed that about him at school. He processed before he acted, which was a good quality that would serve him well someday. But at 8 years old, it mostly expressed itself as wariness. He was deciding something about her. She left him to it. "Thomas," she said at one point, without looking up from the bread she was shaping, "I could use someone to check whether the oven's drawing right. Your father's outside." He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and went to check. "It's drawing fine," he reported. "Good," she said. "Thank you." He sat back down, but he sat down closer to the table than he'd been before. Gideon found her alone in the kitchen near midday, when the children had dispersed for a while. The twins napping, Danny reading the picture book she'd brought, Thomas and Emily doing something outside that involved shouting and a sled. He came in and sat at the table and didn't say anything for a moment. She kept working. She'd found potatoes in the root cellar and was doing something with them. "I appreciate you being here," he said finally. "I'm glad to be here." He was quiet again. She'd noticed he did that. Left space in conversations rather than filling them, which was unusual in her experience. Most people filled space. "The pie looks better than I expected," he said. "Emily has good instincts," she said. "She nearly talked herself out of it twice, but she kept going." "She does that. Talks herself out of things." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Margaret was like that too. Talked herself out of things, and then usually did them anyway." It was the first time he'd said his wife's name in her presence. Evelyn kept her hands moving. "Thomas is more like me," he said. "He just waits and says nothing, and then decides." "I know," she said. "He's been deciding about me all morning." "Has he made up his mind?" "Almost," she said. "He'll get there." She glanced at him then. He was looking at the window at the snow still coming down, a light and persistent fall. He looked like a man who had put something heavy down for a moment and wasn't sure whether to pick it back up. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Gideon," he said. "You can call me Gideon if you're going to be in my kitchen all day." "Gideon," she said. "Did she like Christmas, your wife?" He was quiet for a moment. "She was... Yes." She took it seriously. She started planning in October. The children thought it was funny how seriously she took it. "Good," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I mean, it's good that they had that," she said. "It means they know what it's supposed to feel like. You can't miss something you've never had." He considered that for a moment. "I suppose that's one way to look at it." "It's the better way," she said. "Trust me." He looked at her with something careful in his expression. "Was it a very lonely 7 years?" he said. She hadn't expected him to say it back to her. She felt it land somewhere in her chest, honest and a little sharp. "Some of it," she said. "Not all of it. I had the children during the days. But not after." "Not after," she agreed. She turned back to the potatoes. After a moment she heard him stand, and she heard him go out to where his children were, and she heard Emily yell something at him, and him yell something back, and then the sound of laughter through the kitchen window. His laugh, deeper than she'd expected, a little rusty at the edges like a thing that hadn't been used regularly. She stood at the counter and let herself feel it for a moment. The warmth of it, the house full of noise, the smell of pie coming from the oven, the snow outside and fire inside, the specific texture of a day that was being lived in rather than gotten through. She let herself feel it, and then she told herself very firmly not to make anything out of it, but the feeling stayed. Christmas dinner was chaotic and loud, and the potatoes were not quite done, and the twins knocked over a cup of milk, and James cried about it more than the situation warranted, and Clara told him he was being a baby, and Thomas told Clara to be kind, and Emily said, "That's right, Clara," in a tone of such elderly authority that the whole table went briefly silent, and then Gideon laughed again. That rusty, real laugh. And Evelyn laughed too, and then all 5 children were laughing at something they couldn't entirely articulate, and the milk dried on the tablecloth, and no one cared. After dinner, Danny fell asleep in the chair by the fire. The twins were persuaded, eventually, to bed. Thomas washed the dishes without being asked, which Evelyn noted and chose not to remark on. Emily sat beside Evelyn at the table and they talked, about books mostly, and about what Emily wanted to do someday, which was something involving horses and possibly teaching. She hadn't decided. "You can do both," Evelyn said. "Can you?" "I have no idea," Evelyn said honestly. "But I think you probably can." Emily looked at her with those serious eyes. "My father says you're the best teacher in the county." "Your father is being generous. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean," Emily said. "He's not very good at being polite. He means things." Evelyn looked across the room to where Gideon was sitting on the floor beside the sleeping Danny, his back against the chair, reading by firelight, or appearing to read. She had the sense he wasn't fully taking in the words. "I believe that," she said. She left after dark. Gideon hitched the horse and drove her back himself, the wagon moving slowly through the snow-covered roads, the sky clear now and blazing with cold stars. They didn't talk much on the drive. The silence was, she noticed it particularly, how it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had spent a long day in the same space and were tired in a good way. At the boarding house gate, he stopped the wagon and she climbed down with her empty basket. "Thank you," he said, "for everything today. The children," he paused, "they'll remember this Christmas." "So will I," she said. She meant it as a polite thing to say. The moment it came out, she realized it was more than that. He looked at her for a moment in the starlight. "Miss Hart," he said, and then stopped. "Evelyn," she said. "You called me Miss Hart all day when we were in front of the children. You can call me Evelyn now." "Evelyn," he said, like he was testing the weight of it. Would it be inappropriate to ask whether you'd come again? Not Christmas, just, the children would like to see you, and He stopped. "The children would like to see you." She heard the thing he didn't say the second time. "I'll come," she said. "On Sunday, if that suits." "It suits," he said. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in her coat and hat, and she sat there for a while without taking them off, listening to the silence of the boarding house around her. It was still quiet. Her room was still empty. Nothing had changed in the mechanics of her life. But something was different, and she knew it, and she was too tired and too happy to be afraid of it yet. She took her coat off and went to bed. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, she fell asleep looking forward to Sunday. She came on Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. It happened without anyone deciding it had happened. There was no conversation between her and Gideon where they agreed to a schedule, no formal arrangement of any kind. She simply started coming, and the walkers started expecting her, and by the third week of January, Evelyn found herself sitting at that kitchen table on Sunday afternoons as naturally as if she'd been doing it for years, as if the chair had always had her shape in it. She told herself it was for the children. This was true enough that she could keep telling herself it without feeling like a liar. Danny had started saving things to show her. Rocks, mostly. He had developed a sudden and serious interest in rocks, and kept a collection on the windowsill of his room, each one chosen for reasons he would explain at considerable length if given the opportunity. Evelyn let him explain. She found she didn't have to pretend to be interested. There was something genuinely moving about the way a 6-year-old could invest a piece of creek gravel with meaning. "This one," Danny said one Sunday in late January, holding up something gray and unremarkable. "I found it the day after Christmas. It has a stripe." "It does," she said, "right through the middle. That means something happened to it a long time ago. Thomas said that. He said the stripe is from pressure." "Thomas is right." Danny turned the rock over in his palm. "Do you think it hurt when it happened?" She looked at him for a moment. 6 years old, dark hair sticking up on one side, a small person with very large questions. "I think it probably did," she said, "but it made the rock more interesting." Danny thought about this with the particular gravity that he brought to most things. Then he put the rock back on the windowsill with the others, carefully, in its designated place. The twins were a different matter entirely. Clara and James operated as a single unit most of the time, a noisy and chaotic unit that had zero interest in rocks or books or any form of quiet contemplation, and they had decided within days of meeting Evelyn that she was a fixture in their lives on par with the dog and the woodpile. They called her Miss Evie, which she had not asked them to do and which Gideon had tried twice to correct. She told him to let it go. She liked it. Emily remained the most careful. Not cold, she was, if anything, warmer toward Evelyn than Thomas was, more openly affectionate. But she watched. She was 11 years old and she'd been managing this household in the ways an 11-year-old could manage a household, filling in the gaps that her father couldn't fill, and she was paying close attention to what Evelyn's presence changed and what it didn't. One afternoon in February, when the two of them were alone in the kitchen while Gideon and the boys were outside and the twins were napping, Emily said without preamble, "My mother used to make biscuits on Sunday. Papa can't make them right. He doesn't do the butter cold enough." Evelyn waited. "Do you know how to make biscuits?" Emily said. "I do," Evelyn said. "Will you show me?" It wasn't a request for biscuits. They both knew that. It was something more carefully worded than it appeared, and Evelyn was aware that the wrong answer, or the right answer given the wrong way, would close something that had opened very slowly and with considerable effort. "Get the flour," she said, "and the butter needs to be cold, so we'll cut it straight from the block." Emily got the flour. They made biscuits. They were not perfect. The first batch came out a little flat on one side because the oven ran hotter on the left, and you had to compensate for that if you knew about it, and Emily hadn't known about it, and now she did. The second batch was better. Gideon came in from outside while they were still at it, stamping snow off his boots in the doorway, and he stopped when he saw them at the counter. He stood there for a moment with an expression that moved through something Evelyn didn't quite catch before he put his hat on the peg and came to pour himself coffee without saying anything. "They're not done yet," Emily told him. "I can see that," he said. But he didn't go back out. He sat at the table and drank his coffee while they finished, and the kitchen was warm, and the biscuits smelled right, and nobody felt the need to fill the silence with anything. February thawed a little at the edges and then remembered itself and froze back up. The ranch roads were rough, and Evelyn's Sunday trips sometimes took longer than they should have, the horse picking careful steps through ice-rutted tracks. Gideon started coming to collect her. She told him once that it was unnecessary. She'd been making the trip fine on her own for 2 months. And he said he was going into town anyway, which was sometimes true and sometimes not. She let it go. Those drives became something she looked forward to in a way that she didn't examine too carefully. Gideon Walker was not a man who talked easily, which should have made the rides quiet and maybe uncomfortable. Instead, they talked the way people talk when neither of them is trying to perform for the other, in fragments, about real things, sometimes stopping mid-thought and starting something else, and the other person following without needing the thread explained. He told her about the ranch, the practical and unglamorous reality of it, the fence line that needed replacing every spring, the creek that flooded badly every 3 or 4 years, and the last time it had flooded, he'd lost 2 head of cattle and a season's worth of stored hay. He'd been working to pay off the loss since then. He talked about his land the way people talked about things they loved that were also exhausting, with a mixture of pride and honest complaint that she found more believable than either alone would have been. She told him about Ohio, where she was from, about her father's hardware store and the particular smell of it, metal and sawdust, and the cold that came off the merchandise in winter. About her mother, who had died when she was 12, and the way the house had been different after that, quieter, like something had gone out in it that couldn't be replaced with any amount of work or routine. About her sister, who had married at 19 and built a life that looked like the right life, a husband and children and a proper house, the kind of life their mother would have wanted for both of them. "And you didn't want that?" Gideon asked. "I wanted to want it," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. The road curved and he guided the horse around a drift that had blown across the track. "What did you want?" he said. She looked out at the fields going by, the white of them, the bare black lines of fence posts. "Something that mattered," she said. "Something that was mine. I thought teaching would be it." She paused. "It is, mostly. It's just—" "Not everything," he said. "Not everything," she agreed. Neither of them said anything else about it. The ranch appeared at the end of the track, yellow light in the kitchen window, and she could hear the twins even from outside, could hear Clara shrieking at James about something, and James's indignant response. "Normal Sunday," Gideon said. "Perfect Sunday," she said, and she'd meant it as a joke, a mild irony, but it came out sounding more like what it actually was. He looked at her for just a moment before he set the brake on the wagon. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said, quietly, without heat. He stopped. I know, she said. I know what I said, and I know what you're going to say, and you're right to say it. I'm not asking you for anything. I just meant it's good. That's all I meant. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked away. It is good, he said. That's true. They went inside to the noise and warmth of his house, and she sat at the table and helped Clara with a puzzle and didn't let herself think about the drive or what they'd said or not said, and she was mostly successful. It was Pete Garner who told Gideon first. Pete was his ranch hand, had been for 6 years, a lean, laconic man from somewhere in Kansas who did his work without complaint and his talking without much elaboration. Gideon trusted him the way you trusted someone who'd shown up in weather when he didn't have to. Pete came in from the east pasture on a Thursday afternoon in late February and poured himself water at the pump and said, without looking at Gideon, "People in town are talking." Gideon was repairing a harness at the workbench. He kept working. About what? About the teacher, Pete said. About her coming out here every week. Gideon put the harness down. And what are they saying? Pete drank his water, set the cup down. They're saying various things. Some of it's just talk. Some of it's... Margaret's mother was in the dry goods store Tuesday. Apparently she had some things to say. Margaret's mother. Clara Holt, who lived in a neat house on the north side of Harlan Creek and had been in a state of more or less constant grief since her daughter died and directed a significant portion of that grief outward at anyone she felt wasn't sufficiently honoring Margaret's memory. What kind of things? Gideon said. Pete was quiet for a moment. She said the schoolteacher's been working her way into your house, getting comfortable where she doesn't belong. He kept his voice even and neutral, reporting, She said Margaret's children deserve better than a stranger taking their mother's place. Gideon was quiet. I'm just telling you what's being said, Pete said. So you know. I know, Gideon said. He picked the harness back up. His hands were steady, but he thought about it that night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and thought about what it meant. The talk, Clara Holt's words, the specific phrase taking their mother's place, and all the ways it was wrong and all the ways it landed anyway. He'd been telling himself things were getting better. He'd been telling himself that having Evelyn come on Sundays was for the children, which was partly true and partly a thing he told himself so he didn't have to look at the other part. He was aware, he was not a stupid man, that something had shifted in him over these weeks. Some frozen thing that had been locked up for 3 years and 4 months, and some days had started to move. He didn't entirely trust it. He'd loved Margaret with the specific and certain love of two people who'd grown up in the same county and known each other since they were young and built something together over 20 years. And losing her had taken something out of him that he wasn't sure grew back. He didn't know what to do with Evelyn Hart, who showed up every Sunday with books and ribbon and hard candies, and made biscuits with his daughter, and let his youngest explain rocks to her, and laughed a real laugh in his kitchen and said things like, "Something that was mine," in the cold on a wagon road, and looked at him with a particular directness that he found he couldn't quite look away from. He didn't know what to do with any of it. What he knew was that his children woke up on Sunday mornings differently than they woke up the rest of the week. That Emily had started humming sometimes while she worked, which she hadn't done in 3 years. That Danny had started talking more at dinner. Actual talking, not just answering questions. That the twins' lives had acquired a new word, Miss Evie, spoken with absolute and uncomplicated confidence, as if she had always been part of the vocabulary. He didn't know what to do with that either. He went to bed and didn't sleep well, and in the morning started on the east fence line, which badly needed work. The first time she heard the talk herself was a Tuesday in early March. She'd gone to the dry goods store to pick up a few things after school, and she'd run into Louise Calloway, Mrs. Calloway's youngest daughter, a woman Evelyn's age who worked at the milliner's and had always been friendly in a brisk, not unfriendly way. Louise had been friendly, but there was something careful in her friendliness, a slight overcorrection that people did when they'd been saying something and were now compensating. After a few minutes of easy conversation, Louise said, "I heard you've been spending a good deal of time out at the Walker place." "I have," Evelyn said. "The children needed some—" "Evelyn," Louise's voice dropped slightly. Not unkind. Warning. "People are talking. Clara Holt was in here last week and she said some things, and you know she's not the only one. She paused. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just... You should know. What are they saying? Evelyn said. Louise pressed her lips together. That you're after something. That a single woman making herself comfortable in a widower's house. Every single week, people draw their own conclusions. And Clara Holt is saying you're trying to replace Margaret, and she's saying it to anyone who'll listen. Evelyn stood in the dry goods store with her flour and her tinned beans and kept her face neutral. I see, she said. I just thought you should know, Louise said. I don't think... Thank you, Louise, Evelyn said. I appreciate you telling me. She finished her shopping and walked back to the boarding house and went to her room and sat on the bed and felt the familiar cold wash of it. The specific feeling of being seen in the worst possible light, of having something you know is good looked at from the outside and made to seem small or calculated or wrong. She was not after anything. She was not trying to replace anyone. She was a woman who had been invited into a family that needed something she had to give, and she'd given it, and it had made her happy in a way she hadn't been happy in years. And now it was being taken apart in dry goods stores and general stores and probably church hallways, and she was not going to be able to do anything about it. Or she could stop going. She could send a note to Gideon Walker and say she thought it best, given the talk, if she didn't come out anymore. She could protect herself, her job, her reputation, the reputation of a woman who lived alone and had nothing to protect her except her own good name. She sat on the bed for a long time. Then she thought about Danny and his rocks, about Emily humming at the counter, about Clara and James calling her Miss Evie without any awareness that it was a name they'd invented, that it had never existed before them. She thought about Gideon saying something that was mine back to her on the wagon road, as if he understood exactly what she'd meant. She did not write a note. She came the following Sunday the same as always, and she didn't mention the talk. And Gideon didn't mention it either, and she spent the morning reading to the twins while Emily and Thomas worked on their school lessons at the table. After lunch, while the children were scattered, Gideon found her in the front room where she was reshelving the small collection of books they kept on the shelf beside the window. She'd noticed weeks ago that they were shelved wrong, spines turned in, stacked horizontal in ways that cracked them, and she'd been waiting for a moment to fix it. Evelyn, he said. She kept her hands on the books. You've heard the talk, she said. Not a question. Pete told me, last week. Louise Calloway told me, Tuesday. He was quiet for a moment. She turned around and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at her with that particular steady expression of his, the one that meant he was working through something. I want to say something, he said. Then say it. I should have thought more carefully about what it looked like. A woman coming out here every week, and me not making anything clear, not to the town and not to you. That's on me. I wasn't thinking about your position. She looked at him. Are you apologizing for inviting me? No, he said. No, I'm apologizing for not thinking about what it meant for you. She held his gaze. I'm a grown woman, Gideon. I can think about what things mean for me. I know that. I knew what people might say. I came anyway. He was quiet again. Why? He said. She turned back to the bookshelf and put the last two books in their proper place, lined up the spines. Because your children needed someone, she said, and because... She stopped. Because I wanted to be somewhere I was wanted. That's the honest answer. I'm not ashamed of it. She heard him move. One step, then he stopped. You are wanted here, he said. His voice was quiet, and the straightforwardness of it caught her somewhere she wasn't expecting. She didn't turn around. I know, she said. Evelyn? Gideon. She turned then, and she looked at him directly the way she'd been doing since Christmas, the way that meant she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't heard something that she'd clearly heard. I am not going to stop coming, unless you ask me to, and Clara Holt can say whatever she wants. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Something she recognized but couldn't name precisely, the way you recognized a piece of music without being able to say its title. She's going to get worse before she gets better, he said. Clara, it's not really about you. I want you to know that. It's about Margaret. It's always been about Margaret. I know, Evelyn said. She was a good woman, he said. The words came out with the particular care of something that had been carried a long time. Margaret she was a good woman, and she didn't deserve to die at 34, and her mother has been looking for somewhere to put that ever since. I've been where she put it, mostly. Now it's you. Evelyn was quiet. I'm not going to let her drive you out, he said. She's not going to drive me out, Evelyn said. I told you. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood in the front room of his house in the February cold, both of them knowing something had shifted in the last 10 minutes, neither of them ready to name it. The books were straight on the shelf. Outside, Danny could be heard arguing with James about something involving the dog. Gideon unfolded his arms and straightened up from the doorway. I'll start the stove in the kitchen, he said. It'll be cold in there by now. Good, she said. I was thinking soup. We've got a ham bone, he said. Perfect, she said. They went to the kitchen, and she started the soup, and he started the stove. And after a while, the twins came in tracking snow, and the noise started up again. And the afternoon settled around them with its ordinary and particular weight, imperfect and real, and nothing like enough, except that it was. The trouble arrived properly in March. Not the quiet, manageable kind of trouble, the whispered kind, the dry goods store kind, but the kind that showed up at the door. It was a Saturday, not a Sunday, and Evelyn was not there. She heard about it afterward from Thomas, who told her with the careful, factual recounting of a child who knows he is reporting something important. A buggy had come up the road from town in the mid-afternoon. 2 women, Clara Holt, Margaret's mother, and her sister Vera, who had been living in the next county and had apparently made a point of coming specifically for this visit. Gideon had met them on the porch. Thomas had been in the barn. He'd heard most of it. Clara Holt had said, directly and without preamble, that what Gideon was doing was disrespectful to Margaret's memory, that he was allowing a woman to insert herself into this family with indecent haste, that Margaret's children deserved to have their mother's memory protected, not replaced by a schoolteacher with no family of her own and no proper standing in this community. Thomas didn't tell Evelyn what Gideon had said in response. He said he hadn't heard all of it, but his jaw was tight when he told her, and his eyes had the look of someone who'd been close to something ugly and hadn't fully processed it. Were you scared? She asked him. Thomas thought about it. No, he said. I was angry. At your grandmother? At all of it, he said, with the precision of a person who was being honest rather than polite. She was saying things about you that weren't true, and she was saying things about Papa that weren't. He's not doing anything wrong. He stopped. Is he? She looked at Thomas Walker, 8 years old, serious, deciding things. No, she said. He's not. Then she shouldn't have said it, Thomas said. No, Evelyn agreed. She shouldn't have. She didn't hear Gideon's version until the following Sunday. He told her plainly, in the same tone he told her everything, without embellishment, without asking for sympathy, just the facts of it. He had told Clara that she was welcome in his home as Margaret's mother, that she always had been, but that she was not welcome to speak about Evelyn Hart the way she'd been speaking, and that if she wanted to continue visiting her grandchildren, she'd need to reconsider her behavior. Clara had left angry. Vera had left looking uncomfortable. She'll come back, Gideon said. I know, Evelyn said. She might go to the school board, he said. I want you to know that. She's not a woman who lets things alone. Evelyn felt a cold wire of fear move through her and made herself sit with it. Her job. Her contract. The school board, which was made up of men who valued quiet and order, and a teacher who didn't cause complications. She might, she said. If she does, I'll handle it, Evelyn said. Don't worry about my job, Gideon. I've kept that job for 7 years on my own. I can keep it now. He looked at her. I know you can, he said. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying... He stopped and rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd come to recognize as him working through something he hadn't fully formed yet. I'm saying I don't want you to have to pay a price for being here. That's not fair to you. Life isn't very interested in fair, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at his hands on the table, big, rough-knuckled hands, a working man's hands with a scar across the right palm that she'd noticed early on and never asked about. She thought about the weight he'd been carrying since Margaret died, the way he'd rebuilt his days around the minimum: work, children, sleep, repeat, and how slowly over these weeks she'd watched something come back into him, something that had been gone for 3 years and 4 months and was returning by degrees. Cautious as a person coming in from cold, she thought about her own empty room, her own routine, the tin in the desk drawer. She was afraid. She was genuinely afraid of what this was becoming because she knew what she stood to lose: her position, her reputation, the whole careful architecture of a life built to be enough when enough was all she had. She was afraid of wanting more than she was likely to get. She was afraid of being wrong about what she thought she saw in his face when he looked at her. But she was also 31 years old, and she had been afraid of wanting things for a very long time, and she was tired of it. "I'll be here Sunday," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, it was enough. For now, it was enough. Outside, the last of the February snow was finally beginning to soften at the edges, and the creek that ran along the east pasture was making noise beneath the ice. And somewhere far off across the fields, spring was moving slowly in the direction of Harlan Creek, still weeks away, but coming. Spring came to Harlan Creek the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a cold snap that killed half the things that had dared to bud early. By April, the mud was bad enough that the road to the Walker Ranch was barely passable on Sundays, and Evelyn started leaving earlier to give the horse more time to pick its way through the ruts. She didn't stop coming. The school board had received a letter. She'd been called in to speak with Chairman Gerald Pruitt on a Thursday morning in late March, a meeting conducted in the back room of the bank where the board kept its records. Pruitt behind his desk with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, the way men looked when they'd been told to handle something they found distasteful. He'd asked her, in the polished language of a man who chose his words for legal precision, whether it was accurate that she had been spending regular time at the residence of Gideon Walker. She'd said yes. He'd asked whether she understood that a teacher's reputation was a matter of community concern, and that the board had received correspondence suggesting her behavior was, in some quarters, considered inappropriate. She'd said she understood that was what the letter said. He'd asked whether she intended to continue. She'd looked at Gerald Pruitt across his bank desk and said, calmly and without apology, that she was a grown woman visiting a family with 5 children who had needed assistance over the winter months, that there was nothing improper in it, and that if the board had specific evidence of professional misconduct, she'd be glad to address it, but that she didn't consider her private life outside school hours to be within the board's jurisdiction. Pruitt had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd said that he appreciated her candor and that the board would take the matter under consideration. She'd walked out and kept walking until she was around the corner, and then she'd stood against the side of the milliner's for about 30 seconds, with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat against the cold wood, feeling her heartbeat slow back down. Her contract came up for renewal in June. She was aware of that. She'd been aware of nothing else for 3 days. She hadn't told Gideon about the meeting. She'd told herself she'd tell him Sunday, and Sunday had come, and the children had been loud, and the afternoon had been good, and she hadn't wanted to bring it into that kitchen, and then she'd told herself she'd tell him the next Sunday. It was Emily who noticed. They were washing up after dinner one Sunday in early April, just the 2 of them in the kitchen while Gideon got the twins into bed, and the boys finished their evening chores. Emily washed, Evelyn dried, and they'd developed a rhythm for this over the months. A companionable, easy rhythm that required no management. "You seem different," Emily said. "How so?" Emily handed her a plate without looking up. "Quieter. Like you're thinking about something you're not saying." Evelyn dried the plate. "I'm always thinking about something I'm not saying. So are most people." "This is different," Emily said. She was not a child who accepted deflection gracefully. "Is it because of my grandmother?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother has concerns about my being here. That's her right." "It's not her house," Emily said flatly. "No, but she loved your mother. She's still loving her. That's not nothing." Emily was quiet for a while. The water in the basin had gone gray and cold. She drained some of it out and added hot from the kettle, something she did without thinking, A household habit absorbed so young it was muscle memory. "Do you think she's going to make you leave?" Emily asked. Her voice was careful, not quite steady. Evelyn set down her dish towel. She turned to look at Emily fully. This girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's way of waiting. This 11-year-old who had been running this house in the ways she could run it since she was 8, who had taught herself to be careful with Hope, because Hope had a track record in this family. "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said. "Not because of your grandmother. But something else?" "Emily." "I'm not a little kid," Emily said. "I know something's happening. I'd rather know what it is." Evelyn looked at her. She was right. She wasn't a little kid. And Evelyn had always believed that children handled truth better than they handled the particular anxiety of sensing a truth being kept from them. "The school board got a letter," she said, "suggesting that my coming here was inappropriate. I had a meeting with them. My contract comes up in June, and I don't know yet what they'll decide." Emily was very still. "I'm not going to stop coming because of them either," Evelyn said. "But I wanted to be honest with you, since you asked. Does Papa know?" "Not yet." Emily turned back to the basin. She washed the last cup, rinsed it, handed it over. "You should tell him," she said. "I know. He'll be angry." "I know that too." Emily dried her hands on her apron. "He's not. When he gets angry, he gets quiet, not loud. So if he gets very quiet, that means he's very angry. I just wanted you to know that." Evelyn looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Emily nodded, serious and 11, and went to find her brothers. She told him the following Sunday, after the children were in bed. They'd started doing that in March without explicitly deciding to, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were settled, drinking coffee, or sometimes just sitting, the house quiet around them in a different way than the afternoon quiet. It was the time of day when she saw him most clearly, when the father in rancher armor came off slightly, and he was just a tired man sitting in his kitchen at the end of a long week. She told him plainly, the way she'd been told it plainly. The letter, the meeting, Pruitt's careful language, the contract in June. He was quiet for a long time. "Very quiet," she noted. He looked at her. "Emily warned me," she said. "She said when you go very quiet, it means you're very angry." Something shifted in his face, a flicker of something almost like warmth through the anger. "She's not wrong," he said. "I know it's not your fault," she said. "My mother-in-law wrote a letter to your school board," he said. His voice was level and controlled, and underneath it was something else entirely. I don't even know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," she said. "I handled the meeting. I'll handle the contract." "Evelyn?" "I'm not asking you to fight my battles," she said. "I'm telling you what happened because you deserve to know. That's all." He was quiet again. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She'd learned to read this gesture. It meant he was working through something that had more than one layer. "I'm going to talk to Clara," he said finally. "You already talked to her." "I'm going to talk to her again, more clearly." "Gideon." She leaned forward slightly. "If you go at her hard, she'll dig in. She'll get worse before she gets better, and we both know it. What she needs is—" She stopped. "What?" "Time," she said. "She needs time to see that my being here doesn't erase Margaret. That's what she's afraid of. She thinks if she lets this happen, her daughter disappears." He was quiet for a long moment. "She's not entirely wrong about what she's afraid of," he said. Evelyn held very still. "I'm not saying—" He stopped, pressed his palm flat on the table and looked at it. "I'm not saying what you think I'm saying. Margaret is gone. Nothing changes that, but I've been—" He stopped again. Started again. "There are mornings I wake up and the first thing I think isn't her anymore. And I don't know what to do with that." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not betrayal," Evelyn said carefully. "That's surviving." "I know that," he said. "In my head I know that. But not in the part that decides how to feel about it." "No," he said. "Not there." She looked at him across the table. This man who carried his grief like a physical thing, who had rebuilt a life from loss and was only just now, slowly, beginning to believe it was allowed to be a life rather than just an obligation. She felt an ache for him that was not the ache of pity, but something more complicated and more real. "Gideon," she said, You are allowed to be all right." He looked at her. "You are allowed," she said again, quietly. "That's not nothing. That's permission you have to give yourself." He didn't say anything. He looked at his coffee cup, but some of the tension in his jaw had shifted, and when he looked up again, there was something in his face that was different from the careful, controlled anger of 10 minutes ago. "June is 2 months away," he said. "Yes. A lot can change in 2 months." She wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that, and she wasn't going to ask. "It can," she said. They sat in the kitchen for a while longer without talking, the fire burning low, the ranch quiet around them. And eventually she said it was getting late and she should go, and he hitched the horse and drove her home. And neither of them said anything that hadn't already been said, but the silence had a different quality to it. Less held back, more honest, like something had been put on the table finally, and both of them could see it. The blizzard came in the second week of April. No one was prepared for it. April blizzards happened on the frontier, but they didn't usually come like this one came, fast and total, a wall of weather that moved in from the northwest overnight, and by morning had turned the world white and featureless, wind driving the snow horizontal, visibility down to less than the length of the porch. Evelyn had come out on Saturday that week instead of Sunday. She'd promised Emily she'd help her finish a skirt she was making, a practical project that had turned into something more ambitious than either of them had initially planned and required more time than a Sunday afternoon. She'd arrived Saturday morning with the sky already looking wrong, that particular flat gray-white that old-timers knew to distrust. Pete had looked at the sky when she rode in and said, "You might not be going back tonight." She'd looked at the sky and thought he was probably right and gone inside anyway. By mid-afternoon, going back was not a question. The storm had arrived in full, wind screaming across the open fields, snow packed against the windows on the north side of the house until the glass was barely visible. Gideon had gotten the animals in before it hit badly, and Pete had battened down the barn. The ranch was sealed. The children, initially, thought this was wonderful. The twins were delirious with excitement. Danny stood at the window with his nose against the glass saying, "Whoa," at intervals. Thomas and Emily were sensible enough to help without being asked, and the 5 of them ate dinner that night louder and more chaotic than usual, the storm outside making the warmth inside feel deliberate and chosen. It was Danny who noticed Thomas wasn't right. Thomas had gone quiet during dinner, quieter than usual, not his normal watchful quiet, but something that had a different quality to it, a stillness that was wrong. He didn't finish his plate. He said he was tired, which Thomas never said because Thomas had the energy reserves of a person who didn't know he was supposed to get tired. Evelyn noticed when she noticed Danny noticing. She went to Thomas and put her hand on his forehead and felt what she found there and kept her face neutral because all the children were watching. "You're going to bed," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "Thomas." He looked at her. He read something in her face and didn't argue. She got him upstairs and into bed and came back down and found Gideon in the kitchen. "He has fever," she said. "It's high." Gideon's face changed. "How high?" "High enough that I want to watch it." She kept her voice level. "Do you have willow bark or quinine? Anything for fever?" Margaret kept things in the... He was already moving toward the back of the house, the room where Margaret had kept the household medicines in a wooden box that Evelyn had seen once but never opened. He came back with the box and put it on the table, and she went through it quickly, methodically. She'd learned what she knew about medicine from her mother before her mother died, from a doctor in Ohio who'd boarded with her father and talked through cases at the dinner table in the educational way that some people had, from necessity and reading and the particular knowledge of someone who'd lived alone and had to manage her own sicknesses without much help. There was willow bark. There was a small amount of something that might work. There was a bottle of liniment that was no use for this. "Get me the cleanest cloth you have," she said, "and boil water." Gideon did not ask why or whether she knew what she was doing. He moved. She went back upstairs to Thomas. He was flushed, and his eyes were bright in the wrong way. The way eyes got when the body was using every resource it had for something internal and urgent. She sat on the edge of his bed, and he looked at her and said, "Am I sick?" "You are," she said, "but you're going to be all right." "How do you know?" "Because I'm not going anywhere until you are," she said. He looked at her for a moment with his father's expression, that careful, assessing look. Then he closed his eyes. Was. The night was long, Gideon came up and down the stairs more times than she counted. The other children had been put to bed in various states of worry. Emily had asked 4 specific questions and then gone to bed with the air of someone who was going to lie there awake anyway, which Evelyn suspected was true. Danny had held Thomas's hand for a while without saying anything, which was such a Danny thing to do that it had nearly undone her composure. The twins were too young to understand the specific fear in the house and fell asleep without trouble. The fever climbed through the evening. By 10 it was bad enough that Evelyn was working hard. Cool cloths changed every few minutes. The willow bark steeped and administered in small, careful doses, keeping him talking when he could talk and monitoring his breathing when he couldn't. She moved through the process with the focused calm of someone who has decided that falling apart is simply not currently an option. Gideon sat in the chair in the corner of the room. He was not in her way. She'd expected she might need to manage him, might need to tell him to go downstairs, but he read the situation correctly and stayed out of her hands while staying present. He answered when Thomas woke confused and called for him. He handed her things when she asked. He kept watch. Around midnight, Thomas said, "Papa?" "I'm here," Gideon said. He moved to the bedside. "I don't feel good," Thomas said, which, given that he'd spent the last hour maintaining he was fine, was significant. "I know," Gideon said. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on his son's head and kept it there. "Is Miss Hart still here?" "Right here," Evelyn said. Thomas didn't open his eyes. "Okay," he said, and went back to wherever the fever had him. Gideon looked at her across his son's bed. The lamp was burning low. Outside, the storm was still going. She could hear it in the walls, that constant pressing sound of wind with serious intent. She looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. Around 2 in the morning, she thought the fever might be breaking. She wasn't certain. She'd been wrong before, watching fevers crest and thinking they were coming down and finding out she was early. But Thomas's breathing had settled slightly, and the clamminess was starting, which was the body beginning to cool. "I think it's turning," she said quietly. Gideon was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. He'd been sitting like that for about an hour, and she'd thought about telling him he could go sleep, that she'd wake him if anything changed, but she hadn't because she suspected he wouldn't go. He looked up. "You're sure?" "Not completely," she said, "but I think so." He let out a breath. It was not a dramatic thing, no shaking, no visible relief that telegraphed itself. Just a breath, long and slow, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for hours. "He got sick like this before," Gideon said. "When he was 4. Not this bad, but Margaret was up with him for 3 nights. He paused. "I kept telling her to sleep. I'd take a turn, and she kept saying she couldn't sleep when he was sick. I never understood that until tonight." Evelyn looked at him. "You were up with him too," she said. "No, I mean, I was in the house. But she was the one who—" He stopped. "She knew things. She knew how to do this. I didn't." "You did fine tonight," Evelyn said. "You did fine tonight," he said. "I handed you things." "That's not nothing," she said. "Handing someone what they need when they need it. That's not nothing, Gideon." He was quiet for a while. The storm pressed against the walls. "Where did you learn?" he said. "What you were doing tonight?" "My mother, some. She was good with sick people. She had the patience for it. And there was a doctor in Ohio who boarded with my father for about 2 years when I was a teenager. He was a talker. He'd come to dinner and talk through whatever case he was working on, and I listened." She paused. "I had a lot of fevers as a child myself. You learn things from the inside, too." He looked at her. "Did you have someone? When you were sick?" "My father," she said. "He wasn't very good at it, but he tried. After my mother died, he tried harder." She looked at Thomas, who was sleeping more quietly now. "It matters. Someone trying, even if they're not very good at it." Gideon was quiet again. Then he said, "I've been trying to work out." He stopped. "What?" she said. He rubbed his face with one hand, a tired man's gesture, a man who'd been awake since 4 in the morning working before the storm and was still sitting on the floor of his son's bedroom in the middle of the night. "I've been trying to work out what I'm doing," he said. "What this is. You and me, and—" He gestured vaguely at the house around them. "I don't have a language for it. I've been trying to find one for weeks, and I don't have it." She looked at him steadily. Her own tiredness was bone deep at this point, the kind that stripped away anything unnecessary and left you with only the things you actually meant. "You don't have to have a language for it," she said. "Not tonight." "But eventually," she said, "not tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this is, I was married for 12 years and I still wasn't good at saying the things that needed saying." "Margaret knew that about you?" "She did," he said. "She used to say I communicated best through carpentry. If I was upset, I built something. If I was sorry, I fixed something. She could read it." Evelyn considered this. "What have you been building lately?" she said. He blinked. Then, slowly, something happened in his face that was almost a smile. The first she'd seen from him in hours, rusty and small and real. "The front porch step," he said. "I fixed it in January, twice." "I noticed," she said. "I didn't say anything." "It didn't need fixing the second time," he said. "I know," she said. They looked at each other across the dim room, with the sick child between them and the storm outside and the lamp burning low, and the smile on his face faded into something more serious, more exposed, the expression of a person who has run out of the resources required to keep things properly contained. "Evelyn," he said. "Gideon," she said. "Thomas is going to be fine. The storm will break. There's time. There's enough time to figure this out." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Is there?" "Yes," she said, and she meant it, though she wasn't entirely certain what she was promising, only that she was promising it. Thomas stirred and said something unintelligible, and they both looked at him, and he settled again. And when Evelyn pressed her hand to his forehead, the fever had gone down another degree, and she let herself breathe. By 4 a.m, the fever had broken properly. The clamminess, the soaked sheets, Thomas surfacing long enough to say he was thirsty, in a voice that sounded more like himself. Evelyn got him water. Gideon changed the sheets with the efficiency of a man who'd done it before. Thomas drank and went back to sleep. A real sleep this time. Not the halted, feverish unconsciousness of the last several hours. Evelyn sat back in the chair and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "You need to sleep," Gideon said. "In a little while," she said. "He's going to be fine. You said so yourself." "I know. I just want to watch him a bit longer." Gideon was quiet. Then he said, "I'll watch him. You take the bed in Emily's room. Emily won't mind. I'm not going to take a child's—" "Evelyn." His voice was quiet and had a particular quality to it that she'd heard before. The quality of someone who was being firm because they'd decided to be firm and weren't going to negotiate. "Let me do something useful. You've been going for 8 hours. Sit down in a real bed." She looked at him. He looked back. "Fine," she said. 2 hours. "Fine," he said. She went to Emily's room. Emily was awake. She'd heard the door and turned over and looked at Evelyn with those dark eyes in the dark room, fully awake and waiting. "He's okay," Evelyn said. "Fever broke. He's sleeping right." Emily let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for hours. "Okay," she said. "Your father's with him. Go back to sleep." "Were you scared?" Emily said. Evelyn considered the honest answer. "For a while," she said. "But you kept going." "Yes." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you were here," she said. "I don't know what we would have done if—" She stopped. "You would have managed," Evelyn said. "You're a walker. You manage." "It's better with you here," Emily said. Simple. Direct. The most Emily sentence possible. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. "Scoot over," she said. Emily scooted over. Evelyn lay down on top of the covers in her clothes, and for approximately 90 seconds she was aware of Emily's small, warm presence beside her, and the storm still muttering outside and the quiet of the house that was a different quiet than it had been earlier, a quieter quiet, a safer one. Then she was asleep. The storm broke the next morning. She woke to light, real light, the particular brightness of sun on new snow that came in even through curtains, filling a room with something that felt like apology after a hard night. Emily was already up. From downstairs came the sound of the twins arguing and Danny's voice attempting mediation and failing. She went to Thomas's room. Gideon was asleep in the chair, his head dropped slightly to one side, the position of someone who'd sat down to keep watch and lost the fight around dawn. Thomas was awake, sitting up in bed with a book. Where he'd gotten the book she wasn't sure. He'd clearly retrieved it himself at some point, which meant he'd been awake and functional long enough to think about wanting something to read. He looked up when she came in. "I feel better," he said. "You look better," she said. "I was pretty sick." "You were." He looked at his sleeping father and then back at her. "He stayed all night?" "We both did," she said. Thomas considered this with the particular weight he gave things. "I didn't know I was that sick," he said. "That's how it often goes," she said. "You feel terrible, but you don't know how much until you're on the other side of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Hart," he said. "Yes?" He looked at his father again. The angle of his sleeping face, the untidy state of him, a fastidious man who'd spent the night in a chair. Then he looked at her. "I've been thinking about things," he said. She waited. "I know what people in town are saying," he said. "Emily told me some of it, and I know about my grandmother and the letter." She kept her face still. "Do you?" "I've been waiting," he said, I've been watching to see if you'd stop coming because of what people say." He paused. "You didn't." "No," she said. "I didn't." He nodded slowly, processing. "My mother isn't coming back," he said. It was not a question and not addressed to her specifically. It was a statement made into the air, the statement of a child who had known a thing intellectually for 3 years and was arriving in this room on this morning at something slightly different from knowing. "No," she said quietly. "She isn't." "But you're here," he said. "I'm here," she said. Thomas looked at his book. He turned a page without reading it. Then he said, "I'm glad you stayed last night," in the voice of a child who has decided something and is telling you the result of the decision rather than the process. Across the room, Gideon stirred in the chair. He woke slowly, the way men woke when they'd slept badly, surfacing in pieces, and then he focused on Thomas, and something in his whole body relaxed. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Thomas said. "You look better." Miss Hart already said that. Miss Hart is right. Gideon sat up and rubbed his face and looked at Evelyn. "Did you sleep?" "A few hours," she said. "Emily's room." He nodded. There were things in his face that daylight made more visible than lamplight had. The exhaustion, but also something else, the particular openness that came after a long night when defenses were still down, and the deliberate distance people maintained from their own feelings hadn't been fully reassembled. "Breakfast?" she said. "Breakfast," he agreed. She went downstairs, and a minute later she heard Gideon talking to Thomas in a low voice, the particular quiet of a father talking to a son about something that wasn't going to be said in front of anyone else. She didn't try to hear it. She put wood on the fire in the kitchen and got the coffee going and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the world the storm had left behind. Everything was white and vast and brilliant. The snow was 3 feet deep in drifts against the barn, and the fences were buried to the middle rail, and the sky was the hard, clear blue that came after weather like that, a sky that looked cleaned. The creek was probably blocked in places. It was going to take days to dig out, but the morning was here, and Thomas was upstairs with a book, and Gideon was talking to his son, and downstairs the twins were still arguing in the particular inexhaustible way of 4-year-olds, and somewhere in the house Danny was saying something about rocks, and the coffee was starting to smell right. She stood at the window and looked at the bright, undone world outside and felt something shift in her. Not a dramatic thing, not a moment she could have described to anyone in a way that would have made sense. Just a settling, a quiet arrival at a place she hadn't known she was traveling toward. She'd been afraid of wanting more than she was likely to get. She'd told herself that, Sunday after Sunday, on the drive home in the dark. Standing at the kitchen window in the early morning after a long night, she thought, maybe that was the wrong way to think about it. Maybe the question wasn't what she was likely to get. Maybe the question was what she was willing to do without, and whether she was still willing. She'd told Thomas she wasn't going anywhere. She meant it. She meant all the ways it meant. She turned from the window and started making breakfast. Thomas was back on his feet by Wednesday. He came downstairs Wednesday morning looking pale and slightly thinner, with the particular fragile dignity of a child who'd been sick and was now determined to behave as if he hadn't been. He ate breakfast without being told to, put his plate in the basin without being asked, and went out to help Pete with the morning chores in a coat that was too light for the temperature. Gideon watched him go from the kitchen window and didn't say anything about the coat. "He's stubborn," Evelyn said. "He gets it from his mother," Gideon said. She'd stayed 2 more days after the storm. The roads were impassable until Tuesday morning, and she'd sent word to the school through Pete, who'd managed the main road on horseback, that she was stranded at the Walker Ranch and would return when the roads cleared. The school had managed. She'd been told afterward that the older students had organized themselves and done reading exercises, which she chose to take as evidence that she'd taught them well, rather than evidence that they didn't need her. Those 2 extra days had a quality she didn't try to analyze too much. The storm had stripped away the usual careful management of what she and Gideon were and weren't to each other, and in its place was something more honest and more dangerous. The easy shorthand of 2 people who'd been through something hard together and come out the other side knowing each other better than they had going in. They moved around each other in the kitchen without negotiating the space. They finished each other's sentences sometimes. He knew how she took her coffee. She knew which silences meant he was worried versus which meant he was just thinking. She went home Tuesday afternoon. He drove her, same as always. At the boarding house gate, he stopped the wagon and she climbed down and he said, "The school board meeting is the 15th of June. She stopped. "How do you know that?" "I asked around," he said. "I want to be there." "Gideon, I'm not asking permission," he said. "I'm telling you, I'll be there." She looked up at him on the wagon seat. He looked back with the particular settled quality he had when he'd made up his mind about something. Not stubborn, exactly, more like a door that had been closed and locked from the inside. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She went inside and she stood in her room and felt the particular complicated feeling of being looked after by someone when you'd spent a very long time looking after yourself, and she sat with it until it felt less alarming. Walk. The talk in town had gotten worse while she was snowbound at the Walker Ranch. This was perhaps predictable. 2 days stranded, an unmarried woman, a widower, but knowing it was predictable didn't make it less unpleasant to walk back into. Louise Calloway met her on the street Thursday morning, coming out of the dry goods store, and her face did a thing that told Evelyn everything before she said a word. "How bad?" Evelyn said. Louise fell into step beside her. "Clara Holt was at the ladies' auxiliary meeting Monday. She told the whole room." She paused. "She made it sound, I know what she made it sound like. Evelyn, some of those women are the wives of school board members." "I know that too." Louise was quiet for half a block. "What are you going to do?" Evelyn thought about Gideon on the wagon seat, saying, "I'll be there," in that locked door voice. "Keep going," she said. Louise stopped walking. "That's it? That's your plan? What would you have me do, Louise?" She stopped too and turned to face her. "Apologize for spending a blizzard at a family's house where I was already visiting when the storm hit? Apologize for staying while a child was sick? Apologize for—" She stopped herself. "There's nothing to apologize for, and I'm not going to act like there is just to make Clara Holt more comfortable." Louise looked at her for a moment. "You've changed," she said. "Have I?" "You used to be very careful," Louise said. Not unkindly. "You were always very careful about what you said, what you did, how you were seen." Evelyn thought about 7 winters, about the tin in the desk drawer, about being careful for so long that careful had started to feel like survival. "I'm tired of careful," she said. Louise studied her face. Then slowly, she smiled. A real smile. The first unguarded thing Evelyn had seen from her since this had started. "Well," she said. "All right then." Clara Holt came to the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon in the last week of April. Evelyn saw her through the window as the last students were leaving, the neat, dark buggy stopping on the road, the upright figure climbing down with the particular movement of a woman who considered her posture a moral position. She watched Clara walk up the path to the schoolhouse door and stood at her desk and waited. Clara was 62 years old. She was a small woman who had never been soft. High-boned face, gray hair pinned precisely, eyes that were dark like Margaret's eyes must have been. She came in without knocking, which was not an accident, and looked around the schoolroom with a slow inventory that reminded Evelyn uncomfortably of the way Gideon had looked at it the first time. Except where his had been neutral, hers was searching for something to object to. "Miss Hart," she said. "Mrs. Holt," Evelyn said. "Please sit down." "I'll stand." "Then I'll stand too," Evelyn said, and came around from behind her desk. Clara looked at her with those dark eyes. Up close, Evelyn could see the grief in her face. It wasn't hidden, it had just calcified, the way grief did when it had nowhere to go and nothing to do but harden. "I want to know what you think you're doing," Clara said, "with my daughter's family." "I've been helping a family that needed help," Evelyn said. "That's what I've been doing." "You've been making yourself indispensable," Clara said. "Getting those children dependent on you, making yourself comfortable in my daughter's home. It's calculated." Evelyn felt the anger move through her, clean and cold and, importantly, not particularly useful. She breathed through it. "I understand why you see it that way," she said. "Don't condescend to me." "I'm not," Evelyn said. "I mean it. You've lost your daughter. You're watching someone else in her house, sitting at her table, making biscuits with her daughter. I understand why that looks like replacement. I understand why you need it to be something calculated, because calculated is easier to fight than just someone being there." Claire's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about what I've lost." "No," Evelyn said. "I don't. But I know what those children have lost. I know that Emily was running that house at 9 years old because someone had to. I know that Danny barely talked for 2 years. I know that Gideon has been working himself into the ground for 3 years because working was the only thing that made sense." She paused. "I know that Thomas nearly died last week from a fever that I sat with all night, and I would do it again." Clara was very still. "I am not trying to replace Margaret," Evelyn said. "I cannot replace her. She is those children's mother, and she always will be, and nothing I do or don't do changes that. But those children are alive right now, and they need someone who's alive with them." She stopped. "That's all I'm doing, Mrs. Holt. I'm being alive with them." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her face. A fracture, quickly controlled. The face of someone who is very close to something they've been holding back and is not going to let it out. Not here, not in front of this woman. "You should know," Clara said, voice precise, "that I've written to the school board again about the blizzard, about the—" "I know," Evelyn said. "And you should know that I've spoken to Gideon's brother Robert. He shares my concerns." Robert Walker. Gideon had mentioned him twice in passing, his older brother, who lived 40 miles north and visited rarely. She filed the name. "Then I suppose," Evelyn said, "we'll all have to see how it goes." Clara left. She walked back down the path to her buggy with the same upright posture she'd arrived with, and climbed in, and drove back toward town. And Evelyn stood at the window and watched her go, and then sat down heavily in her chair and put her face in her hands for about 30 seconds. Then she took her hands away and started grading papers. Robert Walker arrived on a Saturday morning in early May. Evelyn was there. She'd come on Saturday again, Otrai. She and Emily had started working through a collection of Margaret's old sewing patterns that Emily wanted to learn, a project she'd proposed herself with a particular care that told Evelyn she'd thought about it for a while before asking. Evelyn had said yes without hesitation. They'd been at it an hour when the sound of a horse came up the road. Gideon went to the door. Evelyn stayed in the front room with Emily, who had gone still in the particular way of a child who recognized the horse. "That's Uncle Robert," Emily said quietly. "I know," Evelyn said. "He doesn't come much," Emily said. "He and Papa don't—" She stopped. "Don't get along?" Evelyn said. "They get along fine," Emily said carefully. "They just don't— they're different. Uncle Robert thinks Papa should have—" She stopped again, and this time she picked the sewing back up, which was Emily's way of saying she'd reached the edge of what she was going to say. Evelyn stayed in the front room. She heard the door, voices, the particular tone of two men being careful with each other. Then Gideon appeared in the doorway. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was level. "My brother Robert is here." She stood up. "I'll go to the kitchen," she said. "No," Gideon said. "Come meet him." She held his gaze for a moment. He meant it. His expression was clear on that point. She came to the doorway. Robert Walker was 2 years older than Gideon and looked it in the ways that mattered. Same build, same dark coloring, but something had settled differently in his face. A certain set to his mouth that could have been judgment or could have been just the way he'd aged. He was looking at her with the careful, calibrating expression of a man who'd come with a preformed opinion and was revising it against the evidence. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Walker," she said. "I've heard a good deal about you," he said. "I imagine you have," she said. There was a brief silence. Gideon stood beside her, not touching, not making any particular display of anything, just present and parallel. "Why don't we sit down?" Gideon said. They sat in the front room. Emily had made herself scarce with a speed that suggested she'd done the calculation and decided she didn't want to be there for whatever happened next. Evelyn could hear the twins somewhere at the back of the house, and Danny's voice keeping track of them. Robert looked at his brother. "You know why I'm here," he said. "Clara wrote to you," Gideon said. "Clara called on us," Robert said. "Came up herself. She's worried about the children, about the situation." He paused. "I told Adele I'd come see for myself." "And what are you seeing?" Gideon said. Robert glanced at Evelyn and then back at his brother. "I'm seeing that you've got a woman in your house on a Saturday morning who isn't family." "She's a friend," Gideon said. "Gideon, she's a friend," he said again in the same tone. "And she's helped this family through a difficult winter, and she saved my son's life 2 weeks ago, and I'd appreciate you choosing your next words carefully." Robert absorbed this. His jaw moved slightly. He looked at Evelyn with the revised expression. "I heard about the boy," he said to her directly. "That you sat up with him." "I did," she said. "Margaret's mother seems to think that was some kind of—" "I know what Margaret's mother thinks," Evelyn said, "and I've spoken to her directly. I respect her grief, but I'm not going to be less present in this family because her grief needs somewhere to land." Robert looked at her steadily. Then he looked at his brother. "You're planning to marry her," he said. "Not a question exactly." Gideon didn't answer immediately. It was the first time the word had been in the room between all three of them, and it landed with the weight of something that had been present for a while and was only now being named. Evelyn felt her heartbeat do something complicated and kept her face steady. "I'm planning," Gideon said slowly, "to do whatever's right. For the children and for—" He stopped. "For everyone." "That's not an answer," Robert said. "No," Gideon said. "It's not." Robert looked at Evelyn again. She held the look without elaborating. "The children," Robert said. "How are they with this? With her?" "You could ask them," Gideon said. Robert seemed to consider this genuinely. Then he stood up and went to the back of the house, and they heard his voice, and Danny's, and after a moment the twins, and then Emily. The conversation ran about 10 minutes. Evelyn and Gideon sat in the front room and didn't say anything for most of it. "I should apologize," Gideon said finally, quietly. "For what?" "For not saying something clear to him just now, when he asked." She looked at him. "You don't owe me declarations in front of your brother," she said. "Maybe not," he said. "But I owed you something cleaner than whatever's right." She was quiet. "I'm going to fix that," he said. "The not saying it clearly part. I'm working on it." She thought about the porch step he'd fixed twice. "I know," she said. Robert came back. He stood in the doorway to the front room and looked at his brother, and then at Evelyn, and then at his brother again, with the expression of a man who'd come expecting one thing and had found something else and was recalibrating. "Thomas told me," he said, "that she didn't leave when he was sick, that she stayed all night." He paused. He said it like it was the most important thing. "It was," Gideon said. Robert was quiet for a moment. "I'm not your enemy, Gideon. I want you to know that." "I know that," Gideon said. Clara is grieving and she's not thinking straight, but she's not your enemy either. She's afraid." "I know what she's afraid of," Gideon said. "Do you know what to do about it?" Gideon glanced at Evelyn. Then he looked back at his brother. "I'm working on that too," he said. Robert stayed for lunch. It was loud and imperfect. Danny spilled his cup and James decided this was hilarious. And Clara told James he was being a baby, and Thomas told her to be kind, and Emily said, "That's right, Clara." All of it, the whole familiar chaos of it, And Robert sat in the middle of it and ate his soup and watched Evelyn move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who knew where things were kept and knew which child needed what and knew exactly how much pepper Gideon would want without asking. When he left, he stopped at the door and said to Evelyn, "I owe you an apology for how I came in." "You came because you were worried about the children," she said. "That's not something to apologize for." He nodded. He looked at her a beat longer. "Take care of them," he said. "I intend to," she said. Chatab. The school board meeting was scheduled for June 15th. The week before it, Gerald Pruitt came to find her after school. He knocked this time, which she noted. He came in and stood near the door and held his hat in the same way that Gideon had held his hat the first time he'd ever come into this room, which felt like a long time ago now. "Miss Hart," he said, "I want to tell you, before the formal meeting, that the board has been discussing your contract." "I assumed," she said. "There have been letters," he said, "as you know, from Mrs. Holt and from others. And there has also been—" He stopped. "There have also been other letters." She looked at him. "From some of the parents," he said, "of your students. 12 of them, as of yesterday." He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers. He held it out to her. "I thought you should see them before the meeting." She took the papers and opened them. 12 letters in 12 different hands, some careful and schooled, some rough and effortful, the writing of people for whom writing was not easy and who had done it anyway. She read the first one, and the second. They were about her teaching, about what she'd given their children, specific things named in concrete. The way she'd worked with Eleanor Briggs on her reading until Eleanor could do it without crying. The way she'd stayed late with the Novak boys because their father was sick and their mother needed them home early, so they had to do their schoolwork here. The way she knew which children were struggling and which were bored and treated those as different problems with different solutions. One letter from Pete Garner, she recognized his handwriting from the few notes he'd sent to school with Thomas, said simply, "She stayed up all night with the Walker boy when the fever was bad," which isn't her job but is the kind of person she is, and I think that's worth something to this board. She read through all 12 letters and then refolded them carefully. "These were organized by someone," she said. "I believe," Pruitt said carefully, "that Mr. Walker spoke to some people." She sat with that for a moment. The porch step, fixed twice. "The board will meet on the 15th, Pruitt said. "I can't tell you what the outcome will be, but I wanted you to know there are people in your corner." "Thank you, Gerald," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and he registered it slightly. A small adjustment in his posture, less formal. "You're a good teacher, Evelyn," he said, "whatever else is being said." He left. She sat at her desk with the 12 letters in her hand and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific texture of being known by a community, of having people around you who paid attention, not the watching kind of attention, the caring kind. She put the letters in her desk, not the bottom drawer, the top one, where she could find them easily, and went home. She came to the Walker Ranch the Sunday before the board meeting and found Gideon alone on the porch when she rode up, which was unusual. Normally there was at least one child visible from the road. "Where are the children?" she said. "Pete took them fishing," he said. "All 5 of them. He's going to regret it." She tied her horse and came up the porch steps. He was standing with his back against the post, arms crossed, looking at her in a way she'd come to recognize over these months. The expression of a man who had something to say and had been working up to it and had decided the time for working up was done. "Sit down," he said. She sat on the top step. He stayed standing. He looked at her, and then he looked out at the property for a moment. The fields coming into late spring green, the barn, the creek line visible at the far edge of the east pasture. "I bought this land when I was 23 years old," he said. "I paid for it myself, starting when I was 17, working every job I could find. I built the barn. I built most of the house. Margaret and I built the kitchen addition together the summer before Emily was born." He paused. "I have never once asked permission from anyone for anything I did on this property or with this life." "I know that," she said. "But I should have been clearer," he said, "a long time ago, about what this is, about what I've been waiting until I had the right language for it, and you told me I didn't need the language, and you were right. But I need to say something anyway." She looked up at him. "I am not good at this," he said. "I've told you that. I'll probably continue to not be good at it. I built things instead of saying things for 12 years, and I'm not going to entirely stop doing that." He paused. "But I don't want to keep not saying something this important." "Gideon," she said. "Let me say it," he said. "I've been practicing." She closed her mouth. "I'm not asking you to replace Margaret," he said. "I know you're not her. I know this is different. I know I'm different than I was at 23, and you're different than whoever you were before you came to Harlan Creek, and He stopped. "We are two imperfect people who have somehow ended up standing in the same place, and I don't think that's nothing. I think that's something that should be said out loud." He paused. "I need you to know that whatever the school board decides next week, whatever Clara Holt does, whatever Robert thinks, none of that is going to change what I want, which is for you to stay, not just on Sundays, not just when the children need something. I want you to stay because I need you here, and that's—" He stopped. "That's a thing I haven't said to anyone in a long time." She sat on the porch step and looked up at him. The mid-morning sun was warm and the creek was audible from here, and somewhere in the far distance she could hear Clara and James already arguing, which meant Pete was learning exactly what he'd signed up for. She thought about 31 years. She thought about the tin in the desk drawer. She thought about a classroom full of paper stars and an empty room afterward, and the specific patient loneliness of a life built to be enough. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know you keep saying that," he said, "because I keep meaning it." He looked at her. "Is that a yes?" "You haven't asked me anything specific," she said. He unfolded his arms and crouched down so he was at her level, which was not a graceful maneuver, and he didn't try to make it one. He just crouched on the porch in front of her with his elbows on his knees, close enough that she could see the scar on his right palm and the gray at his temples and the very specific way he was looking at her, which was the way you looked at something you'd been afraid to want and had decided to want anyway. "Evelyn Hart," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not phrased as a question exactly. It came out almost flat, the way he said most important things, without the upward lilt that made things sound tentative. He said it like a fact he was verifying. She felt it move through her in a wave. Not surprised, she wasn't surprised. She'd known this was coming in the way you knew weather was coming when you'd been watching the sky long enough. But knowing and feeling were different, and the feeling was bigger than she'd been prepared for. "Yes," she said. He nodded, once, slowly, like she'd confirmed something. "Just yes?" she said. "I'm processing," he said. She laughed. A real one, the kind she'd been giving this family for months, and he smiled at it in that rusty, careful way. And then something in both of them let go of something it had been holding, and they sat on the porch steps in the late May sun and didn't say anything for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. After a while he said, "The school board." "The school board," she agreed. "Whatever they decide," he said. "Whatever they decide," she said. "I told you. I'll handle it." "We'll handle it," he said. She looked at him. "We," she said. "We," he said. From far off across the fields came a shriek that was unmistakably James, followed immediately by Clara's voice saying something with great authority, followed by what was probably Pete saying something in a tone of deep regret. Gideon stood up. "I should probably go rescue Pete," he said. "Probably," she said. He held out his hand. She took it, and he pulled her up, and he did not let go immediately after, and she did not move away, and they stood on the porch of his house in the warm morning for a moment that was imperfect and real and more than enough. "Come on," he said. "We'll both go rescue Pete." She went with him across the fields toward the sound of his children, and the creek glittered in the distance, and somewhere behind them the house sat solid and warm in the morning sun, and the porch step he'd fixed twice held steady under both their feet as they left. The school board meeting was on a Tuesday. Evelyn sat in the hard chair across from the 5-man board and answered their questions, cleanly, without apology, with the same professional directness she'd brought to every interaction with this institution for 7 years. She addressed the allegations precisely. She did not make excuses. She did not explain herself beyond what was relevant. When she was done, Gerald Pruitt asked the board if there were additional questions. There weren't. The vote was 4-1 in favor of renewing her contract. The one dissenting vote, she later learned, was a man whose wife was in the ladies' auxiliary and who had heard Clara Holt's account and had not heard much else. The other 4 had read the 12 letters. She walked out of the bank building into a warm June afternoon and stood on the sidewalk and let the air hit her face. She wasn't shaking. She'd been too focused during the meeting to be afraid. And she wasn't afraid now, just emptied out in the way you got after something high stakes was over. Gideon was waiting outside. He was standing by his wagon on the other side of the street, hat on, arms at his sides, watching the bank door. When she came out, he looked at her face and read the answer in it. He crossed the street. 4-1, she said. He nodded. He did not say anything dramatic. What he did was reach out and take her hand, in the middle of the main street of Harlan Creek, in plain sight of everyone who cared to look, which was, at that moment, a fair number of people. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him. People are watching, she said. Let them watch, he said. Louise Calloway was across the street outside the milliner's, and Evelyn saw her see them, and Louise smiled. The real smile, the unguarded one she'd given her back in March. Evelyn smiled back. Gideon kept hold of her hand as they walked to the wagon. He helped her up. He climbed up himself and picked up the reins. Ready? He said. I've been ready, she said. He drove them home. The town knew by Wednesday. There was no announcement. There didn't need to be. Harlan Creek was the kind of place where a man holding a woman's hand on the main street in broad daylight was its own announcement, and by Wednesday morning the information had traveled through every household that cared to receive it, which was most of them. Some received it warmly. Some received it with the particular tight-lipped silence of people who disapproved but had run out of actionable objections. A few received it with genuine happiness, the way Louise Calloway received it, with relief almost, as if something that had been held in suspension had finally settled into its proper place. Evelyn went to school Wednesday morning the same as always. She taught her lessons. She corrected her papers. She stayed late to work with Eleanor Briggs on fractions, which Eleanor found baffling and upsetting in equal measure. And by the time she'd gotten Eleanor to a point of cautious competence, it was past 5 and the light outside had gone golden. She locked the schoolhouse and walked back to the boarding house, and Mrs. Calloway met her in the hallway with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. I hear congratulations are in order, Mrs. Calloway said. They may be, Evelyn said. Nothing's formal yet. Mrs. Calloway pressed her lips together in a way that meant she had opinions. He's a good man, she said finally. Gideon Walker. He's had a hard few years. He has, Evelyn said. You're not who I'd have pictured for him, Mrs. Calloway said. Evelyn looked at her. I mean that as a compliment, Mrs. Calloway said with some effort. Margaret was... She was a very particular kind of woman. Very warm, very easy. You're more... She stopped. More difficult? Evelyn said. More certain, Mrs. Calloway said. About yourself. Margaret was certain about other people. You're certain about yourself. A pause. I think maybe that's what he needs now. It was the most Mrs. Calloway had ever said to her in 7 years of living under her roof. Evelyn stood in the hallway and absorbed it. Thank you, Mrs. Calloway, she said. Don't thank me, Mrs. Calloway said, already retreating to her kitchen. I still think the timing was fast. It was, Evelyn thought. And also, it had taken 7 winters, so it depended entirely on where you started counting. Clara Holt did not come to her again. She did not write another letter to the school board. There was no point. The contract had been renewed and signed. What she did instead was go quiet, which Gideon said was not necessarily better. She goes quiet when she's deciding something, he said. He and Evelyn were in the kitchen on a Sunday in late June, the windows open to the warm evening, the children outside chasing fireflies with a jar, and a great deal of competitive argument. She did it before she wrote the first letter. She did it before she came to the school. What do you think she's deciding? Evelyn said. Whether she can live with this, he said, whether it's something she can accept or something she has to keep fighting. He was quiet for a moment. I think she's tired. She's been fighting it since Christmas and nothing's changed. Everything's changed, Evelyn said. I know, but not in the direction she wanted. She looked at him across the table. He looked tired too. Not the bone-deep exhaustion of the winter, but the ordinary tiredness of a man who worked hard and had 5 children and was navigating complicated things simultaneously. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that he had not had anyone to share the complicated things with for 3 years, and that the having of it was still new to him and sometimes sat awkwardly. "I'll go see her," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." "She wasn't kind to you." "No," Evelyn said, "but she was honest. She said what she actually thought, which is more than most people manage." She paused. "And she lost her daughter. I can't be angry at someone for not knowing how to carry that." He was quiet for a long moment. "When did you get so—" he started, then stopped. "So what?" "I was going to say forgiving," he said, "but that's not the right word. You're not particularly forgiving, you understand things, where they come from." She thought about that. "I think it's the teaching," she said. "You spend enough years figuring out why a child is behaving badly, you start applying it to adults." "Do we all just behave like children?" "Mostly," she said, "just with better vocabulary." He almost smiled. Outside, James shrieked about something, and Clara shrieked back, and Thomas's voice came in low and managing, doing what Thomas did. "I'll come with you," Gideon said, "to Clara's." "Let me go first," Evelyn said. "Alone." He didn't like it, she could see that, but he nodded. She went to Clara Holt's house on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before the end of the school year. It was a neat house, the neatness of a woman who had always taken care of things and hadn't stopped taking care of things when everything else fell apart. The garden was trim, the porch was swept, the curtains in the windows were white and pressed, even in summer. Clara answered the door herself. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment with no readable expression. Then she stood back and let her in. They sat in the front parlor. It was a room full of Margaret, photographs on the wall, a sampler she'd apparently made as a girl hanging by the window, small particular objects that meant things to the woman who'd arranged them. Evelyn looked at the photographs and saw Margaret Walker clearly for the first time. A dark-eyed woman with a strong face and an easy smile, the kind of face that looked like it laughed often. She could see Emily in it. She could see Thomas's watchfulness in the way she held herself, even in a photograph. "You came alone," Clara said. "I came alone," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. She was wearing her good dress, which told Evelyn she'd known this visit was coming even if she hadn't known when. "I expected Gideon to come yell at me," she said. "Gideon's not angry," Evelyn said. "He's worried about you." Clara's jaw tightened. "He doesn't need to worry about me." "He does it anyway," Evelyn said. "That's the kind of man he is." Silence. The clock on the mantel ticked. "I loved my daughter," Clara said. It came out rough, without preamble, the way things came out when they'd been stored under pressure for too long. "I know you did," Evelyn said. She was a good woman. She was a better woman than I was at her age. She had a patience with people that I never had." She stopped. "Gideon loved her, whatever you think." "I know he loved her," Evelyn said. "I've never thought otherwise." Clara looked at her sharply. "Then what do you think you're—" "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that he loved her, and she's gone, and he has 5 children who are alive right now and need someone who is also alive. That's what I think." She paused. "I'm not asking you to like me, Mrs. Holt. I'm not asking you to pretend this is easy, or that it makes sense, or that it doesn't hurt. I'm asking you not to make those children choose between grieving their mother and being allowed to be happy. Because they can do both. People can do both." Clara was very still. "Emily talks about her mother," Evelyn said. "I want you to know that. She talks about her when we're cooking, when we're sewing. She'll say, 'My mother did it this way,' or Mama used to say. I don't correct her. I don't redirect her. I listen." She paused. "Thomas has her photograph beside his bed. Danny keeps one of her buttons in with his rocks. He told me it was the most important thing in the collection. The twins don't remember her, and that's a grief they're going to carry their whole lives. And there's nothing any of us can do about that except make sure they know she was loved and she loved them." Clara's face had changed. Not softened exactly. Cracked, maybe. The way something cracked when pressure shifted. "I'm not replacing her," Evelyn said. "She had 20 years with that family. I'm what comes after, and what comes after doesn't erase what was. It just keeps things going." She stopped. "I think you know that." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the photograph on the wall. Her daughter, laughing at something outside the frame. She would have found this very funny, Clara said. Margaret, she always said Gideon needed someone who'd push back at him. Evelyn said nothing. She said he was too used to being right, Clara said, because he usually was, which made it worse. A pause. Something shifted in her voice. Still grief, always grief, but grief with a different quality to it, a slightly less armed quality. She was very funny. People don't always remember that about her. They remember she was warm and good, but she was also funny. Tell me, Evelyn said. Clara looked at her. Tell me something funny she did, Evelyn said. I want to know. And something happened then that Evelyn had not entirely predicted, and probably should have. Clara Holt, who had been a wall and an obstacle and an ache in the room for 6 months, looked at her daughter's photograph and started talking. She talked about Margaret the way people talked about people they'd lost when they finally found someone willing to hold the weight of it with them. In pieces at first, carefully, and then with more ease, more detail, laughter coming in at the edges, and then the grief behind the laughter, and then the laughter again because that was how it worked. That was the honest, complicated truth of loving someone who was gone. Evelyn stayed 2 hours. She didn't try to fix anything. She didn't offer consolation or perspective or any of the useful things she'd been prepared to offer. She just stayed and listened, and it turned out that was the thing that was needed. When she left, Clara walked her to the door. She stood on the porch and looked at Evelyn with the complicated expression of a woman who had expected an enemy and was not sure what she had instead. I'm not going to pretend I'm happy about this, Clara said. I know, Evelyn said, but She stopped. Those children are all I have left of her. I don't want to lose them too. You won't, Evelyn said. I'll make sure of it. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went back inside. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. It was 2 women standing in a doorway acknowledging that they were going to have to find a way to occupy the same world and that they'd both just agreed to try. That was enough. Some things didn't resolve cleanly. They just reached a point where the fighting cost more than the living, and everyone involved made a quiet decision to start living instead. They were married in September. Not a large wedding. Gideon didn't want large, and Evelyn didn't want large. And when they'd sat down to figure out what they actually wanted, it turned out to be almost the same thing. The children, Pete, Robert, and his wife Adele, who had come around fully by August, Louise Calloway, Gerald Pruitt and his wife, and a handful of the parents who'd written letters in June. They were married in the front room of the ranch house on a Saturday morning, with the windows open to the early fall air, and the twins in their best clothes arguing in a whisper about something that wasn't important. And Danny, with a good rock in his pocket for luck, and Thomas standing very straight beside his father and Emily. Emily, who had known what she was doing when she asked Evelyn to teach her to make biscuits. Standing beside Evelyn with an expression of profound satisfaction, the expression of a person who has executed a long-term plan successfully. Evelyn noticed the expression. After the ceremony, while people were eating and talking and the twins had abandoned their good behavior entirely, she pulled Emily aside. You, she said, planned this. Emily arranged her face into innocence. I don't know what you mean. The biscuits, Evelyn said. Back in February, you didn't really need me to teach you how to make biscuits. Emily's innocence wavered slightly. I didn't know how to do the butter cold. Emily, a pause. I knew if you started teaching me things in the kitchen, you'd keep coming back. And if you kept coming back long enough, Papa would... She stopped. He's slow, she said. He needed time. Evelyn looked at her. 11 years old, a child who had decided what her family needed and had gone about securing it with the quiet, strategic patience of someone twice her age. You could have just asked me to keep coming, Evelyn said. You might have said no, Emily said, if you knew I was asking. But if it happened naturally, you wouldn't have a reason to say no. Evelyn thought about this. About the months of Sundays, the gradual accumulation of presence and trust, the way she'd told herself each week it was for the children, until the truth of it was so large she couldn't look away anymore. Your mother was very funny, Evelyn said. Did you know that? Emily blinked. How do you... Your grandmother told me, Evelyn said, a few weeks ago. Emily went still. You went to see her? I did. Something moved through Emily's face, a cascade of things quickly controlled. How is she? She's grieving, Evelyn said. She's going to grieve for a long time, but she's all right. She paused. She loves you children very much. She's just been bad at showing it in a way that didn't cause damage. Emily was quiet. Are you going to make us see her? I'm going to invite her for Christmas, Evelyn said. What happens after that is between all of you. Emily thought about this. Danny would like that, she said finally. He asks about her sometimes. I know, Evelyn said. Emily looked across the room to where Gideon was talking with Robert, both of them holding coffee cups and looking more comfortable with each other than they had in years. Something about the occasion having thawed something between them that had been stiff for a while. Is it strange, Emily said, being here, like this, officially? Evelyn followed her gaze. The front room of the house she'd spent the better part of a year learning. Every corner of it familiar now, the way the afternoon light moved across the floor, the particular creak of the third stair, the fact that the left back burner on the stove ran hotter and you had to compensate, the sound of Clara and James playing somewhere outside, Danny appearing in the doorway with his suit jacket already slightly askew and his expression of pure, undiluted happiness. No, she said, it's not strange. It feels like something that was already true finally got said out loud. Emily considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she went to find Thomas, who was talking to Pete about horses with a seriousness that suggested he was planning to have that conversation for a while. Winter came again, as it always did. The first snow fell in November and the second in December, and by Christmas the valley was under the particular deep white that Evelyn had been watching from schoolhouse windows for 7 years, beautiful and impassive and full of cold stars at night. She had moved into the ranch house in October. She'd had very little to move. Her books, her clothes, the tin from the desk drawer, a few things that had accumulated meaning over 7 years of living alone. She'd left the boarding house with no ceremony, and Mrs. Calloway had shaken her hand at the door, which was more warmth than she'd ever shown in 7 years and felt like exactly enough. Her room at the boarding house became, almost immediately, a room she could not quite picture anymore. The way you couldn't picture a place you'd been before a significant change. You knew it had existed. You could describe it if pressed, but it didn't live in you the way the new place lived in you. The ranch house was already in her before she'd moved in. It had been getting in her since Christmas Eve, since the first time she'd sat at that kitchen table and felt the particular warmth of a house being lived in rather than gotten through. She taught school 5 days a week and came home to the ranch every afternoon. She said came home in her head at first with a small internal catch, a slight awareness of the phrase as new, and then one day in November she said it without the catch, and that was when she knew. The children continued to be themselves, which was the most honest thing that could be said about them. The twins remained a continuous small disaster that she and Gideon managed by a combination of strategy and acceptance. Danny's rock collection had migrated to a more prominent shelf in the front room, which Gideon had allowed with only minor protest, and which Danny acknowledged with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose priorities have been recognized. Thomas had grown 1.5 inches over the course of the year and was starting to have opinions about the ranch's management that Gideon found alternately impressive and exhausting. Emily had finished the skirt they'd started together and moved on to more ambitious projects, and she'd started talking again about what she was going to do someday. The horses and teaching combination still in the running, though she'd added a vague possibility involving writing, which Evelyn had encouraged without reservation. The work of becoming a family, the real work, not the ceremony of it, was mostly unglamorous. It was figuring out that Evelyn made the coffee too strong for Gideon's preference, and he'd been drinking it without saying anything for 2 months before she noticed. It was the argument they had in October about the east fence line, which Evelyn thought needed doing differently than Gideon did, and which she was right about, and which he acknowledged she was right about 3 days later without quite using the words "you were right," but with actions that conveyed it. It was Thomas going through a period in November where he was angry again, not at anything specific, just the diffuse anger of a child processing change, and Evelyn knowing to let him be angry and not to take it personally, which she did not always manage perfectly, but managed often enough. It was James waking from a bad dream and calling for her, not for Emily, not for his father, for her, and her going, and sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, and the particular quality of being needed in that specific way, which was different from every other way she'd been needed in her life, and which she had not expected to feel as large as it felt. The imperfect days were most of them. That was the truth of it, that no one talked about when they talked about families, the way the ordinary, difficult texture of it was constant, the way it required something from you every day whether you had it to give or not. There were mornings she was short-tempered. There were evenings Gideon came in from the fields already worn down, and she said the wrong thing, and he went quiet in the wrong way, and they spent an hour in the same kitchen not quite talking before one of them crossed the distance. There were days the children needed more than there was to give, and everyone was just tired, just imperfect, just getting through. But the getting through was together. That was the difference that mattered. She understood over those first months something she hadn't fully understood before, that loneliness was not simply the absence of other people. She had been surrounded by other people's children for 7 years and had been lonely. What loneliness actually was, she thought, was the absence of people who were yours, people whose ordinary days intersected with yours in the specific and daily way that created, over time, a shared life. You could be in a crowded room and be completely alone. You could be in a kitchen with one other person and be completely found. She had been alone for a long time without fully knowing the shape of it. You didn't know the shape of a thing until you stood outside it and looked back. Clara Holt came for Christmas. It was Gideon's idea finally, though it had been Evelyn's suggestion. He'd thought about it for a month and come to her one evening and said, "We should invite her," in the tone of someone who had arrived at a decision and was stating it. She'd said yes and let him think he'd arrived at it himself, which she suspected he knew she was doing, but which seemed to work for both of them. Clara came on Christmas afternoon in her neat dark buggy with a pie she'd made herself and a careful expression. She came in and the twins descended on her with the absolute democratic affection they extended to anyone who entered the house. And she went stiff for a moment and then, visibly, let herself not be stiff and crouched down to their level and said, "Well, you're both loud, aren't you?" Which Clara and James received as the compliment it probably wasn't intended as. Danny showed her his rocks. She looked at each one with the patience of a woman who'd raised children and knew what was required. She said, "This one is interesting," about the striped stone, and Danny looked at her with pure, uncomplicated happiness. Thomas was polite and a little careful. He watched his grandmother the way he watched new situations, with that assessing patience, reserving judgment. By the end of the afternoon, he'd moved from the far side of the room to sitting near her, and they'd had a conversation Evelyn couldn't hear, but which involved Thomas showing Clara something in the book he was reading, which was Thomas's highest form of acceptance. Emily was the most complicated, as Emily tended to be about most things. She was warm but watching her grandmother and Evelyn in the same room, watching how it went, ready to intervene if something went wrong without being sure what intervention would look like. Nothing went wrong. What happened instead was quieter than wrong. Clara and Evelyn moved around the kitchen at one point, at the same time, working on different things, and they negotiated the space without collision. And at one point, Clara said, the potatoes need more salt." And Evelyn said, "I was just thinking that..." And they looked at each other, and it was not warmth exactly, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but it was the beginning of something workable, something honest. After dinner, when the children had scattered and Gideon had taken the twins to bed and Pete had gone home and Robert and Adele had left an hour earlier, it was just Evelyn and Clara in the kitchen, cleaning up. The same kitchen where Evelyn had made soup on Christmas Day a year ago, the same table, the same window, looking out at the same cold dark. "It was a good dinner," Clara said. "The pie was excellent," Evelyn said. "Margaret's recipe," Clara said. She wasn't saying it as a weapon. Evelyn knew the difference by now. She was saying it the way she needed to say it, to make Margaret present, to insist on her presence. She made it every Christmas. "Will you teach Emily?" Evelyn said. "The recipe. I think she'd want to learn it." Clara looked at her. Something in her face shifted again. That fracture, that careful readjustment. Yes," she said. "I could do that." "Next time you come," Evelyn said. Clara turned back to the basin. She washed in silence for a moment. Then she said, "You're different than I expected." "Better or worse?" Evelyn said. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "Different." They finished the dishes. Clara put on her coat and her hat, and Evelyn walked her to the door. On the porch, In the cold, Clara stopped and looked out at the property. The snow-covered fields, the barn, the creek frozen under its covering, the sky enormous and dark and full of stars. She loved it here, Clara said. Margaret, she always said the sky was bigger out here than anywhere else. It is, Evelyn said. Clara stood there for a moment longer. Then she said, without turning around, "Take care of them." "I will," Evelyn said. "I already am." Clara nodded once. She went to her buggy and climbed in and drove back down the road toward town, and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched until the lamp of the buggy disappeared around the bend in the road. She stood there a little longer after that. The night was very cold and very clear, and the snow was the kind of blue-white that came from starlight, and the ranch was quiet around her. The particular quiet of a place that held sleeping people, the full and weighted quiet that was different from every other kind. She heard the door behind her. Gideon came out and stood beside her. He'd gotten the twins down, which based on the time had probably taken longer than usual. He stood next to her in the cold without a coat, which was characteristic, and looked out at the same dark she'd been looking at. "She came," he said. "She came," Evelyn said. "How was it, really?" "Really," she said. "It was a beginning. Not a resolution, but a beginning." He nodded slowly. He took her hand without looking at her, a comfortable gesture, the gesture of someone who'd done it enough times that it had become ordinary in the best possible way. "Danny told her about the rocks," he said. "I know. She was very patient." "She always was," he said, "with kids. She was different with adults, but with kids she was always patient." He paused. "She and Margaret used to spend hours in the garden. That's the version of her I grew up knowing, before." "That version's still in there," Evelyn said. "She just needs somewhere to put it." He was quiet for a moment. "You did a good thing," he said, "going to see her, inviting her. It needed doing. A lot of people would have said it didn't. A lot of people," she said, "haven't spent 7 years in a classroom figuring out that the difficult ones are usually the ones who need the most patience." He looked at her then. That particular way he looked at her, the way she'd first noticed on a Christmas Eve a year ago and had been accumulating meaning ever since. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What?" "About what you said, back in October when we were arguing about the fence line." "I said a lot of things about the fence line," she said. You said this ranch needs someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong, that Pete won't because Pete works for me, that my brother doesn't because Robert is too far away and too careful. And you said," he stopped, "you said you'd been telling yourself you didn't need anything for so long that you'd forgotten to notice you were lonely." She remembered. The argument had started about fence posts and had ended somewhere considerably more honest, the way their arguments tended to. "I said that," she agreed. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "because I did the same thing, for 3 years. I told myself I was fine. I was managing. The children were all right. Everything was getting better. And I believed it because the alternative was admitting how much was missing." She waited. "And then you showed up," he said. "And I noticed. I noticed because you were so clearly not performing anything. You weren't trying to seem all right. You just were what you were and you said what you meant, and you didn't. You didn't make it easy to keep pretending." He paused. "I'm not sure I've said thank you for that." "You built me a bookshelf in November," she said. "That was thank you?" "That was thank you," she said. "I know your language." He was quiet. Then he said, "The porch step." "Both times," she said. The laugh came then. The real one. The one that had been getting less rusty all year, and she heard it in the cold, clear night and felt it in her chest the way she always did. A man who laughed like he'd forgotten he was allowed to and was remembering. She had spent 7 years lighting a lamp for someone else's house and walking home in the dark. She had gotten so used to the dark that she'd started to think it was just what night looked like. She understood now that it was not. What she understood, and this was the thing she wouldn't have been able to say at 31 but could say now, standing on this porch, in the cold, with her hand in his and sleeping children behind the door, was that the life you got was not usually the one you'd planned. It was not orderly. It did not arrive when you were ready. It came in the form of a man with snow on his coat and 5 motherless children behind him, asking something you almost said no to, and everything depended on the almost. She had almost said no. She had almost protected herself all the way out of the thing that would save her. And the fact that she hadn't, the fact that she'd been tired enough of careful to say yes, was not a small thing. It was the entire thing. People waited, she thought, for the guaranteed version. The version where you knew how it would turn out before you began, where the risk was manageable and the outcome was certain. But the guaranteed version did not exist. There was only the going forward or the not going forward, and the not going forward had its own costs, quiet ones. The kind you paid in 7 winters in an empty room and a letter you read until the paper went soft. You had to decide at some point that the possibility of the thing was worth the risk of it. And you had to decide it without knowing. You had to decide it from the inside of the uncertainty, which was the only place the decision could actually be made. She had decided. She was still deciding, every day, the way you decided when the thing was real rather than finished. "Come inside," Gideon said. "It's cold." "1 more minute," she said. He stayed. He always stayed when she said 1 more minute. She looked out at the property that was hers now, some really hers. Not by paperwork, but by the daily choosing of it, by the accumulated weight of all the mornings she'd been here for, and all the evenings, and all the difficult middles of days. The fields under snow, the barn, the creek. The enormous winter sky that Margaret Walker had always said was bigger here than anywhere else, and that Evelyn now knew was true. 1 year ago tonight, she had stood at a schoolhouse window watching Clara Briggs run toward her mother at the gate. 1 year ago, she had sat in an empty classroom with paper stars overhead and a letter in the bottom drawer that she'd read too many times, waiting for something she had stopped believing was going to come. It had come. Badly timed and imperfect and accompanied by fever and blizzards and school board meetings and a mother-in-law who was working on it. It had come in the form of hard work and difficult conversations and a man who expressed himself best through carpentry and 5 children who had needed her and had let her need them back. That was how it came, she thought. Not the way you pictured it, the way it actually was. She took 1 more breath of cold air, squeezed his hand, turned toward the door, toward the warmth on the other side of it. "All right," she said. They went inside together, and the door closed behind them, and through the kitchen window the lamp burned steadily against the dark, and the snow kept falling the way it always had and always would, quiet and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to what happened beneath it. What happened beneath it was this: 5 children sleeping in their beds, a man who had learned to laugh again, a woman who had finally stopped walking home. The lamp in the window was hers. The house behind it was hers. The life inside it, imperfect, ongoing, real, was hers. She had stopped lighting a lamp for someone else's home. She was home.